Hello, and welcome to today's live webinar from the Publishing Campus, 10 Tips for Writing a Truly Terrible Journal Article. My name is James Picken, and I'll be moderating this webinar. We'll begin with a 30-minute presentation from Bert Blocken, and then move on to a question and answer session where webinar attendees can ask Bert any questions you may have. If we run out of time, further questions can be asked in the Mendeley community group that has been set up for this webinar topic. You will receive an email containing a link to the Mendeley community group within a day or so, along with a link to the on-demand recording of this webinar. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Bert Blocken. Bert is a civil engineer holding a PhD in building physics. He is full professor in the Department of the Built Environment at Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands, and part-time full professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Bert has published 130 articles in international peer-reviewed journals and is among the 150 most cited researchers worldwide in both the fields of civil engineering and of energy science and engineering. Further, Bert is an editor of Building Environment and an associate editor of Wind Engineering and Industrial Aerodynamics. He has acted as a reviewer for more than 70 different journals. One thing before I hand over to Bert, our slides are running slightly slowly today, so please bear with us if there's a short delay between frames. Over to you, Bert.
Okay, thank you, James, for the very kind introduction. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I had a short slide actually about, well, introducing myself briefly, but since James already has done that in a very kind way, I think we can be very brief here. So I'm originally from Belgium, and I got my MSc and my PhD in civil engineering from Leuven University. And then I spent 2 years as a postdoc, 1 year at Leuven University and 1 year at Concordia University in Montreal. And as mentioned by James, I'm now currently working at both Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands and Leuven University in Belgium. And my areas of expertise are urban physics, wind engineering, and sports aerodynamics. And as also mentioned by James, I'm involved in 2 journals, 2 Elsevier journals, Building and Environment and Journal of Wind Engineering. So I'm advertising them a bit here. If you have a very nice piece of work that would fit in these journals, of course, you're more than welcome to submit to us. Right, before we start, and this is something that James has also mentioned, and I would like to stress this, you will receive an invitation email after this webinar, and this email will allow you to join the Mendeley group where all of us can actually continue the discussion. Right, what you might have noticed concerning both this webinar and also the article itself on the Publishing Campus is that we have chosen a particular painting to represent actually the contents of these tips, and there's actually this one. It's a scream from the Norwegian expressionist artist Edvard Munch from 1893, and we chose this actually because it represents to some extent the reaction of probably many supervisors and reviewers and editors when they sometimes see some articles coming in. And I'm pretty sure that my own supervisor back in 1999, when he received my first draft, probably had the same reaction, and maybe he had the same reaction with my second and my third and my fourth draft and so on. Nevertheless, this is the image for this webinar. And before actually we dive into the 10 tips, I would like to mention a few potential reasons why we want to publish research, or why we should publish research. And I will use quite some quotes here. And this is the first one. When you are long gone, your scientific legacy is in part the literature that you left behind and the impact it represents. And we do research because, of course, we want to extend human knowledge beyond what is already known. And in order to do that, of course, we need to communicate. So we need to publish our research results to make them known to the wider community. The third reason is actually an alternative to that is a bit more detailed, saying that a paper is an organized description of hypotheses, data, and conclusions intended to instruct the reader. And the second sentence is an interesting one. So if your research does not generate papers, it might just as well not have been done. And this is actually a quote that also exists in different other forms. This is a very brief one. If it wasn't published, it wasn't done. So apart from you who did the research and maybe some people that you told, maybe over dinner or over a drink, if you don't publish it, nobody else will know, and actually you've been wasting time and resources. So it's very important to get your research results out there and to publish them. And yeah, indeed, if your research is good and useful, which of course it should be, there's of course no reason to keep it a secret. Some other potential reasons, well, the society and the funding organizations in many cases will have invested in your work, so they also expect, of course, a return on investment, so that's an additional reason. You might want to support your department, your university, your institute, because publications and citations, of course, are important for not only your personal career, but also for international rankings. And as I just mentioned, also your own career will benefit from very good publications and resulting citations and resulting appreciation that you will get. Then there is a series of other reasons. And these reasons actually I modified slightly from a list provided by Wellington. And so you might want to publish your results before because you want to join the research community. Then vanity or self-esteem or self-fulfillment might even be reasons. Financial reward could be a reason. Might be interesting when there is a commonly adopted viewpoint that you try to challenge that with the research results that you have obtained. And then maybe, last but not least, maybe sometimes not least, is that a very nice publication might also get you to a conference in very nice places, where, of course, you will have to present your work and listen to all the other presentations, rather than only do sightseeing. But it's generally a nice side effect of presenting a paper at a conference. Okay, a bit more serious now. I briefly want to mention scientific misconduct because it's a problem that seems to be on the rise as publication pressure is rising. It appears that also the cases of scientific misconduct are rapidly increasing. And I'm using here the definition by the Office of Research Integrity of the US Department of Health and Human Services. And this is a rather clear one. It states that research misconduct means fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, so an acronym FFP, in proposing, performing, or reviewing research or in reporting research results. So what does the first one mean? Well, fabrication is making up data or results and then recording or reporting them. Falsification means that you are going to manipulate research materials or equipment or processes, or maybe you want to change or omit inconvenient data of results, and that in that way the research is actually not accurately and adequately represented in your publication or your research record. And then finally, plagiarism is when you actually take somebody else, his or her ideas, processes, results, or words, or full sentences or sections, even sometimes full papers, without giving the appropriate credit to this person or these persons. And actually self-plagiarism is a subcategory of plagiarism. So what is not scientific misconduct is honest error, and of course this can happen, but you should never double check or triple check your results. You should actually maybe check them 10 or 15 times to make sure that of course you do not provide errors in your publications. And differences of opinion of course can also exist, but in science and engineering we try to be as objective as possible and to remove subjectivity to the largest extent. So other items of scientific misconduct or misconduct in view of publishing is submitting the same paper twice, either to the same journal or to different journals, not being proper or handling properly concerning the author list. So, for example, removing people that did significantly contribute to the work, or adding people that did not contribute at all. Of course, you need also to acknowledge sources and resources, and so on. So let's now move towards the core of this webinar, actually the 10 tips for writing a really, truly terrible journal article. So the motivation actually for me to first write these 10 tips and then actually hold this webinar for you is twofold. First, it's related to my own experiences as a research supervisor, reviewer and an editor, because you often see the same errors coming back, and some of them are really tough to get rid of. A second reason is that, of course, money is a very precious resource in the world, but time is at least equally precious. And the idea here is actually efficiency. So by trying to get rid of some typical errors to reduce the waste of time for yourself, for supervisors, for reviewers, and for editors. So what these 10 tips or these 10 guidelines do is actually indicating what you should certainly not do if you want to get a good article. First, some disclaimers. These tips will be quite well known to many of you. So it's definitely intended for early career researchers, and even many early career researchers, I think, will recognize these tips, but reminding you about them, I think, will not hurt. What I do need to say is that they are definitely not complete, because there's only 10 of them. And 10 others I will give at the end of this webinar, so that will make 20, but even these 20 will not be complete. So you might want to add to these tips in the discussion. And then finally, these tips are, of course, and the contents of these tips are biased based on my own experience in the limited field of science and engineering. And they will to some extent be generally applicable, but there might also be some limitations depending on your discipline. So remember, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And there's a few things that can happen. If you mess up and you have a terrible article that you will submit to a particular journal, well, you might be lucky, and that's in scenario 1, that maybe the editor rejects it, or it goes to the reviewers and then the reviewers reject it. And then, well, you made quite a bad impression with the editors and reviewers, and usually these are also smart people with a good memory, but the damage might remain within limits. However, things can get worse if your article gets published. Then it gets digitally archived, and as long as the Earth will be rotating probably, so as long as electronic records will exist, people will be able to read what you actually have written in this article. So your children, your grandchildren, your grandchildren will all be able to see how much actually you have messed up. So certainly scenario 2 should be avoided, but we aim here at avoiding those scenarios. Right, let's get started. This is the overview of the 10 tips. So I will not read every one of them now separately. We will directly move to the first one. And the first one is actually also pointing to what you should do at the start of your research project, which of course precedes publishing of your results, and that's reading the literature. So you might want to refuse to read the literature in your field. But you should, of course, realize that it's very important that if your research wants to have some value, it should, of course, be based on what is already known, what is already available, and your publication should actually add knowledge to the field. And this is something that should also hold for a review paper. So a review paper is not valuable if it just repeats items or knowledge that you can find already in other papers. You really have to add something to the knowledge and new insights that were, for example, based on reviewing the literature. Repetition of earlier work is something that you should never do. It's a waste of your time, but it's also a waste of time of the editors and the reviewers that will potentially start reading your article. And although you might think that it's certainly impossible to read all the papers and publications that have already been published and are continuously being published by the people in your field, well, papers of course have titles and they have abstracts, and these are actually meant to help you discriminate on what you will read in detail and what you will actually not read in detail. And of course you might want to narrow your literature study down very much to the actual field of your study. So this is an example of an article that I co-authored some time ago with two colleagues, and the name of the journal already indicates the type of articles, of course, that you can expect in it. And then you read the title, you might want to have a look at the short abstract, and if the abstract is written in a good way, then it gives you a good indication of what you can find in the article, and then you might decide whether you want to actually read this or not. Right, let's move on to the second tip, and this is a very important one. So this is also the one that I will spend most time on now by addressing it. And that's actually, okay, suppose that you do the literature review and you print these papers and you read them and you actually like some of them, or maybe you like some sections in these papers and some of the figures, maybe even the results. You might want to decide to copy that, to put it in your paper and to put your name on top of it. And this is of course what is called plagiarism, and certainly nowadays with more and more publications being added on the internet continuously, you can rest assured that sooner or later plagiarism will be detected, and this is something that I think you should always have in mind, and you cannot be careful enough. So there are many academic publishers that actually have digital procedures to very efficiently detect plagiarism, such as, for example, the Crossref similarity check. And I will show you now just an example of a paper that I handled, I think 2 weeks ago for Building an Environment. Of course, the name of the author and authors and of the institution have been blanked out. But this is actually what you see as an editor if you check a paper for plagiarism. So this is the Crossref tool that shows at the top right side the percentage of overlap with other existing sources. And you see 18%, that it might seem as a lot, but of course there are some sentences that are difficult to write in other ways. So this does not necessarily indicate that this is a case of plagiarism. However, then you need to look further in this article. And at some places you might indeed find that a lot of sentences, or at least large parts of sentences, are really taken from one particular other publication, which was in this case written by another author. So this is quite problematic, and if you continue reading or checking, you might also find other sentences or parts of sections just actually taken from another publication. So although this is not the most severe case of plagiarism that one can imagine, because you see here and there some words are changed, this of course was enough to reject this paper. It can get worse, and when things get worse, also the consequences can be worse and should be worse. So I would also like to give you an example now of a case of plagiarism that actually happened to me. So it's somebody that plagiarized one of my articles, and then the actions actually that were taken by Elsevier after a quite elaborate procedure to actually go against this action by these authors. You might find that the example I will be giving you and the actions that have been taken, that these are quite harsh, but you also should remember that plagiarism is actually theft of ideas or words or results, and that's a crime. So I think there's no better statement than to indicate this here in red letters. So this is an example. This is an article that I wrote with 3 very good colleagues. It was published in 2011. It was a review article, so quite lengthy, and we studied more than 350 other articles and books because of it. And then actually in February, I think, of 2016, I regularly check actually for plagiarism, and then I actually found a case. And how can you check for plagiarism? Well, concerning articles published in Elsevier journals, you can very easily use Science Direct. You take as the search term your last name, you search for references, and then you can find articles that are actually citing your work, and then you can immediately see whether they're actually copying part of your work or not. So this was actually a case where not just some words were taken, but large parts of sections were copied word by word, exactly every point and every comma in the same way. So these are some pages of my article that you can see here, and what I highlighted in yellow are actually the parts that were literally just taken over without adding quotes, without adding references, although actually my article did appear in the reference list, but of course that is not enough. So then you report this to the publisher, you report it to the editor, and of course this is a very serious matter, both for the plagiarized authors and the plagiarizing authors. So the publishers take these things very seriously. So after a procedure of about 6 months, with having consulted anonymous experts, also editors of other journals, then a committee reached the decision that indeed this was a very severe case of plagiarism and that it should be retracted. And what then happens actually is that the journal publishes a retraction notice, like the one that you see here on this screen. So again, I of course have blanked out the name of authors and their institution. So that's a notice referring to the title of the paper. And then you see at the bottom, and I'll read it up aloud for you. It says that one of the conditions of submission of a paper for publication is that authors declare explicitly that their work is original and has not appeared in a publication elsewhere. As such, this article represents a severe abuse of the scientific publishing system. The scientific community takes a very strong view on this matter, and apologies are offered to readers of the journal that this was not detected during the submission process. So that's quite a clear message. And that's not all. What is then also done is that the article, the PDF, remains online, but every page is stamped in big red letters retracted. And I think that all of us here will agree that this is something you don't want to happen to your article. So this is actually a bit like the modern fire stake, and although indeed you might think that this is quite harsh as a repercussion, you have to remember plagiarism is a crime. And if you do it, you also have to be willing to suffer the consequences. So that's why also in these 10 tips I wrote that plagiarism, no matter how small and no matter how old the documents are that you are plagiarizing, it's a very effective route if you want to do academic self-destruction. Right? Third tip, omit key article components. What do I mean by that? Well, is that usually articles written in science and engineering should have a certain order of items, an order of sections can that be, that should appear in the text. So first you summarize the state of the art. Based on the summary, you should be able to identify the knowledge gap that you have been addressing. You should also be, of course, be able to specify why what you will actually execute will be novel. So you will define objectives to actually fill this knowledge gap. To reach these objectives, you need a research methodology, which of course you have to explain in detail. And finally, you will have obtained results and you derive conclusions, and that's it. So these are key article components. Concerning methodology, strictly you should report the methodology in such a complete way that any reader, also with your background, will have enough information from this methodology, from your report, to do exactly the same work as you did and to find also exactly the same results as you did. And I know that in many fields of science and engineering it's very difficult to achieve this, but at least we should do an attempt. Tip 4 is disrespect previous publications. And there is many ways in which you can do that. Number one, of course, is what we mentioned in tip 2 is plagiarism. So actually taking work by others and pretending that it's yours. But just repeating earlier work without adding novelty to it is something that also might lean towards plagiarism. The same goes for claiming research findings by others, either indirectly or directly. if there are publications that focus on a similar topic as you did, and you don't cite them, well, that's also quite disrespectful and also not something that will make your particular paper stronger. And yeah, dismissive statements on other publications, of course, have no place in scientific publishing. So, and actually, a while ago, I read in an article this sentence, where I, of course, removed the names, stating that the work by authors A and B from this particular year was executed in a very poor way, and therefore we did it again. And this is, well, something that, of course, has no place in a scientific publication. One thing that is particularly important is that many authors, many young authors, think that if they have a long reference list at the end of their paper, that this would indicate that the work that they did is not sufficiently novel. But actually, I think the opposite is true. If you have a long reference list at the end of your paper, that usually means, well, that hopefully means that you also actually read these articles, that you know what is in them, and that therefore you are in a very good place to define what is really novel, what is really new, and that should actually then be the contents of your paper. So every time that I, as editor or reviewer, I receive a paper where there's only 10 or 12 references in the reference list, I get very suspicious. I don't mean that you have to add like 80 or 100 or more, unless when it's a review article, but at least you should provide the reader with a balanced view of the state of the art. Tip 5, overestimate your contribution. So this actually refers to incorrect or unjustified self-congratulations, a lack of critical self-reflection. So in short, actually a lack of modesty. Some variant towards this, or to this, is that you can often read in a paper that the authors state that something is done for the first time, but you have to be extremely careful when you want to express this kind of statement, because your statement, of course, has to be 100% correct and certain. So if you write, this paper demonstrates for the first time that, you can never guarantee that this is really done for the first time. Maybe somebody did it before and didn't publish it, or the person did it before and published it in some anonymous conference proceedings that are collecting dust in some bookshelf. You have to be more careful than that, and you have to make your statement watertight. So your statement 100% correct. And in order to do that, and also to add some modesty to your statement, you might want to write, to the best of our knowledge, this paper is the first attempt to, and then actually you can be sure that your statement will probably have a stronger positive impact on the reviewers and on the readers than the other statements. Also, please bear in mind that it's always much easier to see shortcomings in the work of others than in your own work, because usually you're so much embedded in your own work that after a while you might not see some items anymore that really need improvement. So that's why I think all of us should be really happy with co-authors, with reviewers and with editors, that even though their comments might lean towards rejection of your paper, or they might be quite harsh, still I think you should realize that these comments are critical comments that you can use to actually improve your contribution in your paper, and maybe you cannot submit it to the same journal anymore, but improve it substantially and then give it a second chance. Tip number 6, excel in ambiguity and inconsistency. And I will give a few examples here. What you should also bear in mind is that readers of your articles cannot read your mind. So they only read what you write down on paper. And so most readers do not have a crystal ball that they can rub and then actually read what you have been thinking at the time you were writing your articles. So be aware of that. And be aware of that when you are writing and also rereading and revising your article. I will give 2 examples here. So this is actually an example that I fabricated. So this is not something that I actually read in a particular article. It's actually a figure from one of my own papers. And I'll just read 4 sentences to you that, for example, appear in the same section but not necessarily directly behind each other. So you can read along with me. The model has dimensions length by width by height equal to, and so on, cubic meter. Then a few sentences later it says the model is shown in the figure below. Then a few sentences later we use a standard capsule model for closure. And another few sentences later, near-wall physics is taken into account by a wall function model. So these 4 sentences have 4 times the word model in it. And 4 times the word model means a completely different thing. So this is really something that can be really very confusing. And in this way, you might give even the most patient reader a terrible headache. So the first sentence actually means the geometry of the model, or the geometry, or the geometric model. In the second, it means a computational grid, which is not a geometry. In the third, it means a turbulence model, which is neither of the preceding 2. And in the fourth one, it means near-wall treatment. So if you use a word, make sure you use this word with always exactly the same meaning within the same article. Another example, the second one. So again, a figure, and 3 sentences in the same section might read as follows. The geometry is shown in the figure below. The building is oriented southwest, and the surface roughness of the obstacle is 1 centimeter, 0.01 meter. So what you see here is that we use 3 different words to actually indicate exactly the same thing. And for you as an author, this will be clear because you read it, and you have of course much more you wrote it, and you have of course much more information than the readers about the background of the research. But for a reader that sees this for the first time, it can be utterly confusing, and actually you're giving this person 100% pain. So please do not do this, and be careful in terminology. So remove ambiguous and inconsistent items. And this is something that, well, my advice here, of course, is different from what you probably were told in high school, because there it's stated that if you write text, you should keep changing the words, so not repeat the same words all the time to make actually the text more appealing to read. You can use comparisons and metaphors and so on. But this is something you should not do in a scientific article. You're not writing a mini novel, you're writing a scientific article which is intended to communicate in the most unambiguous and consistent way the research results and that you've obtained and the methodology to arrive at those results. So you should not allow that the reader will have to start interpreting what you have been writing because it was insufficiently clear, because that actually means that you have failed as a writer in communicating your message clearly. Tip 7 is apply incorrect referencing of statements. I'm going to exaggerate a bit here, but the most clear and clean way of referencing is that every statement in your article should be immediately backed up by a suitable reference. So if you don't put a reference after a statement as the one shown on this slide here, then it actually means that it's your statement. If it was a statement by somebody else, you might be committing plagiarism. If it is a statement by somebody else, you need immediately to add the reference to these authors. And by that, you also shift actually part of the responsibility of the contents of the statement towards these authors. Or you should be able to prove this statement yourself in your article. Right? Tip 8, prefer subjective over objective statements. So if we write an article, we try to communicate the work as objectively as possible. So imagine, for example, these results. So I'm not going to go in detail here about what is actually shown in this graph, but the diamonds, the gray diamonds, are measurement results. And then there is a solid line, a curved line, that's actually computational results. And you see that at some places there's quite a good overlap, so there is a good agreement between both, and at other places not. So depending how you look at this figure, and if you are the researcher yourself and you know how difficult it is to get this kind of results, then you might be a very happy person. And then you might also want to transfer that very happy feeling that you got to your readers, to the reviewers, saying that we found an excellent agreement with the experiments. Well, this is something you better not do, because what you find excellent, others might find not excellent at all, or maybe not even good, depending on the viewpoint and depending on what the results would be used for. So please try to remove all this kind of subjective terms and replace them by objective terms, for example, stating that the deviation between measurements and computations is X%. Right, moving on to tip number 9. So finally, your article is in a rather good shape, but you've been writing or typing in a hurry, so there are some grammar and spelling errors, and you still need to make figures and tables, and that's of course also a lot of work. So you might want to give yourself a break there and just dump some figures into the paper and then submit it. Be careful here, because the figures and also the type of language or the quality of the language is also what makes how viewers and editors will think about your article and your work. So actually, personally, I find that if you dump a very sloppy article in the inbox of a journal and put editors and reviewers to work, that's actually an indication of a lack of respect for not only your supervisors but also for these individuals. So there is a nice proverb, and the origin of it is actually an issue of debate, but let's stick to the proverb itself that says, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And that's true, but only if the picture can actually be read. And I will give a few examples here that I've taken from some other articles. I made it anonymous, of course, and I hope that the authors that made these figures will ever forgive me. But I will give some comments on these figures, and this is the first one. Okay, it says Reynolds number as a function of position, but especially what I see here is a big green stain that has very little informative value. Okay, we move to the second one. This could be a nice painting, but actually what it represents is a top view of a building with wind flow around the building and coming into the building opening, so cross ventilation. But of course, you should never make such a figure without adding the color bar and adding the units and the name of the variable that is represented here, because otherwise this is indeed just a colorful figure without any informative value. If you add a color bar and you add axis indications and the name of the variable and maybe even some units, then of course you need to make sure that they actually can be read. And sometimes it might be tempting to add all kinds of figures on top of each other, like color contours and streamline plots and maybe some vectors here and there. But in the end, you might end up with a big mess where nobody can still actually see what you're trying to communicate. But regularly, not enough, but still regularly, we also get very good examples. And this is a nice example, and although indeed the numbers, the font size on the axis, the horizontal and vertical axis, is quite small, this is actually an example of a very well-made figure with a clear color bar, no units, but it's a dimensionless variable indicated here. So this is really an illustration how a figure in this kind of work should be done. Finally, the 10th tip, imagine that you come to the stage where you actually get comments back either directly from the editor or after the reviewers have done their work from the reviewers and the editor. Then of course it's up to you what you do with these comments. And there's no need to agree with all of these comments, but of course you always have to remain polite and respectful, because the reviewers do their work for free and the editor almost for free. So this is very important. So to respect the work that they actually have done to help you with your article. It's important also to answer every comment that the reviewers and the editors have raised. And you should really also remember that these actually are, apart from your supervisors, your first readers. So the comments that they have will probably also be comments that other readers later will have in your article. And it's keeps surprising me that when I get a revised document back from the authors, that sometimes they react to the reviewer that they either don't agree or agree, and they provide a very elaborate discussion in the document response to reviewers, but they do not change anything concerning this comment in the article itself. And then, of course, the readers will have exactly the same questions which will remain unanswered. So if you write as a response to reviewer comment, thank you for your comment, this is a very valuable comment, and you do not add anything in the text of the paper, well, then this answer to this comment is of course completely useless. So as we are approaching the end of this webinar, I will just very briefly give you 10 additional tips. And as opposed to the foregoing 10 tips, these are actually tips of what you should do when preparing and submitting your article. So first, carefully select the most appropriate journal for your work. So then read the journal scope. And if you have questions, just email the editor, because editors will be happy to clarify the scope if needed, or to tell you if this article fits in the journal or not. Then, when you have decided where you want to publish, you need to write your article specifically guided or oriented towards that journal, because some journals have very clear guidelines on the contents of specific sections. So don't waste your time starting to write an article without knowing where to submit it. Just first decide where to submit it, and then you move from there. Also, one paper, one message. So salami slicing, as it is called, when you have one particular piece of research and splitting it up into 5 different subparts, and then trying to get 5 papers out of it, of course, is not done. But what is also not very useful and very convenient is that you have different research topics or research results, and you all try to squeeze them in one paper. In the end, try to indeed uphold one paper, one message, and this message preferably should be in the title and also in the abstract. Then select also an attractive and a descriptive title, because most readers will only read your title, and based on that they might already decide whether they want to read your article or not. And if they move to further than just looking at the title, they will look at your figures. So make figures as seductive as possible. So they should be clear and attractive, and then you might get the readers actually to focus further in detail on your article. Modesty and honesty are very good traits of life and life in general, but also in academic publishing. And if you have a good research result and you are very satisfied with that result, it might be that you obtained that after a lot of difficulties and partial failures. It will be very useful to the academic community, to the scientific community, to report on those difficulties and on those failures. So that is something that most people, most scientists will much more appreciate, and they can much more relate to that rather than only seeing the success that came at the very end. So actually we did that quite a while ago, and just focusing on everything that I did wrong in a particular topic in terms of simulations, and then putting that into an article. And this is something that can easily be recognized by other researchers. So this is therefore, I think, also my most cited article so far. So if you start writing a paper, do not start writing the first sentence and then the second sentence and then the third sentence, because by the time you are at the third sentence, you maybe are not happy anymore with the first sentence. So then you will be losing a lot of time trying to iterate between sentences and jumping from beginning to the later part of your paper. So just first make the structure, start with the title, start with the key component, state-of-the-art knowledge gap, and so on. First write one sentence per item, check it with your supervisors, your co-authors, and then afterwards you can extend these sections. And then in the end, what you're actually doing is just filling in the gaps after you have agreed on a particular structure. And this might save you a lot of time. Number 8, become a reviewer as soon as you can. So you learn a lot from reviewing good papers. You also learn a lot, maybe even more, from reviewing poor papers. And editors are usually very pleased when they can welcome a new reviewer to the journal, certainly if you will do your job as a reviewer in a very thorough and a very correct way. Then 9 is an evident one, always be polite and respectful. And finally 10, which might be a bit surprising here, but I still want to add it explicitly. It is okay to cite your own work if this work is good and relevant in your future publications, because one might think that if you do not respect your own work and you do not find it good enough, you cannot also expect other people to respect it. And in the end, your literature list just has to be complete, whether it includes articles by yourself or not. This criterion or this requirement doesn't change. So, okay, this is almost the end of this webinar. And just before we conclude, I just want to mention briefly again that within the day or so you will receive an invitation email from James with a link where you can join the Mendeley group, and we can actually keep the discussion going about this particular topic. So then, towards the conclusion, as I mentioned earlier in this webinar, there can be many reasons for publishing your work. But actually, we could also think that we also do it for a higher purpose. And then this particular quote by Rogers is a very nice one. It's not the honors and the prizes and the fancy outsides of life which ultimately nourish our souls. It's a knowing that we can be trusted, that we never have to fear the truth, and that the bedrock of our very being is good stuff. And then, really as the conclusion, probably the single most important thing in scientific research and in academic publishing is quality. Quality is everything. And a great paper does not happen by accident. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that very informative presentation, Bert. There are quite a few questions, so if I read some of them out, I think we still have a few minutes there. Perhaps you could respond to them. Okay, here's one. With regards to plagiarism, if a study by the same author is closely related and some sections are the same, can it be termed as plagiarism?
Yeah, I think what is important that if you use the same methodology, of course, as other authors, which will happen, and you report this methodology, that in itself is not plagiarism. If you report this methodology with exactly the same words and sentences and maybe even figures as the other authors did, that might be considered as plagiarism. So it is, I think, unavoidable to have some overlap in terms of contents, because state of the art, of course, when you are writing an article and at the same time your colleague in another country is doing the same on the same field, your state of the art, if you both did a good job, should be quite similar, but they should not contain the same sentences. So that is indeed something to remember, that you have to develop your own text, you have to develop your own figures, unless you want to quote or cite the work by others, and then you add also the quotation marks and the reference. And if you use a figure by somebody else, you need first to request permission, copyright permission, and then also always add the reference.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. And I've got another one here. Is it acceptable to critique a previous review by other authors at length in the justification for your updated review on the same topic, so long as your critique is an accurate reflection of the limitations of their work?
Yes, I think that is absolutely correct. So this is something you can do, and I think it might even be your moral scientific duty to do so. Indeed, with the additional specification that you provided, if you are correct and you are as thorough and as honest as possible. And indeed, what is equally important, that you can provide the evidence to back up all the statements and all the critique that you are providing. And that, I think, is indeed for the benefit of the scientific community, that if there are things unclear or maybe errors have been published, because nobody is perfect, these are also rectified, or at least that the discussion continues and is allowed to continue until rectification is obtained.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I think we've got time for one more. Is it possible to present the same article in more than one conference? And also, is it possible to present a study in a conference and publish in a different journal publication?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. I know that many authors indeed do that, so that they first have the conference paper and then later extend it into a journal version. I've actually been wrestling with that question myself, and I've also talked about it with several colleagues that are also editor in journals. And actually what came out of that discussion is that it is okay to do so, but just make it clean and clear and put it into the open by a footnote on the first page that this particular paper or part of it has been presented at an earlier conference and that the journal paper is an extended version. So I think full clarity and full honesty, I think, are the best guidelines here.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So, yeah, transparency is everything. Okay, well, thank you very much, Bert, again, and thank you, all of the attendees, for attending. It's been a very informative session. Should you have any more questions, we encourage you to ask these in the Mendeley group that we'll send you a link to within the next couple of days. There were many more questions asked during the session which we haven't had time to answer. We'll post these on the Mendeley group as well, and Bert will kindly go in and respond to those. So if you visit the group, then you should be able to see the answers to the full range of questions. And just one more thing, we have another webinar scheduled for next week on March the 7th on the topic of peer review, presented by biomaterials editors, professors Abhay Pandit and Henry Yu. You can sign up at thepublishingcampus.com at the upcoming webinars section at the bottom of the page. So I fully encourage you to join in. Thank you very much once again, and have a good day, everybody.